which was the best memory we all have.
I believe this is the most popular time for video games.
I do think that gaming is quite popular with my generation. I am Gen Z.
You know, the problems that we deal with in our real lives become too difficult sometimes, and you just kind of need a break.
One of those things where I would never know what would happen.
So I think that would be very interesting for me to be born 20 years in the past.
Hello and welcome. This video is part 2 of Asking Gen Z Gamers. Today's questions are, do you think gaming is popular with your generation / people your age? How do you think your view on gaming differs from those older / younger than you? And if you play games that didn't exist then, what do you think you would be doing instead if you were born 20 years earlier or 40 years earlier? And we are again hearing from JStore, Tim, Quackoos, Distralis, Commander Kate, and Shards of Gaming, who all have gaming channels on YouTube. Find the links in the description.
So basically with this one, it depends on what you grew up playing. Like, I look up at these PS4 games and be like, oh, it was so much better in the Xbox 360 and PS3 days. But in reality, it's just my nostalgia trying to take over. Except Minecraft. That game is not nostalgic, it's just extremely, extremely good.
I do think gaming is popular with people of my generation because we've always had it. And I think people from older generations have not always had gaming that was multiplayer, online, that sort of thing. So they don't understand how social it can be and that it can really be more than just a game. It can be a place where you make friends and that sort of thing.
I'm actually a full-time college student. I'm doing engineering. So the people who are around me aren't mostly that much into gaming because, they have other things to do. And I completely agree with that because even I'm getting a lot more busier these days. So it's difficult to keep doing gaming. But at the same time, I think people of my generation are still playing a lot of games. But I think that these days gaming has become a lot more competitive and the bar is just too high these days. Like there's always someone or something coming up with something even better than the better one because I don't know, maybe with time the standards are just getting so high. I sometimes really appreciate the old times when the games were just really simple and really just was about having fun with your friends and just, driving around. For people younger than me, I don't know what games they're playing right now. I really hope they start their childhood by playing Minecraft. And then years later, they can look back to the diamond house they made in creative mode, which was the best memory we all have.
With video games being much more normalized now, and with access to play much easier now than it ever was, I believe this is the most popular time for video games. The younger generation, growing up with more electronics and items that involve more of the internet, are growing to be much more accepting of gaming than, say, the older generation. It's not always the case, though, because there are plenty of people that are older and also play video games as well.
This is actually a good question. I think nowadays with where we're at technologically, the internet, everybody's connected to each other. You can be located in the United States, in any state, and have friends in Britain, in China, in all kinds, like all across the world. And I think that's really cool. And I think, part of that, and social media, Twitter, Instagram, that stuff aside, is one thing, but for me, I think what really brings people of my generation together, at least that are into it, is gaming. Games like focus a lot on multiplayer now. So games like Warzone, Fortnite, just anything you can play multiplayer is really fun. And I think it's a really good way to, just connect with people and meet people because you obviously have a similar interest already. You're already playing the same game. So right there, you have something in common. And I think that's cool because now you've got a foundation to build a potential relationship off of. Another thing too is kind of like I said before, I'm into virtual reality games like VR Chat and Facebook Horizons and things like that, or I think it's Horizon Worlds now because they changed the name. Any kind of like virtual social platform is another big thing too. I remember in the late 2000s, maybe like early 2010, Second Life was a big one that people were playing, and it's not really around, I think, as much anymore. It's not as relevant, but I think it's still up. I think people still play it. It's just another way that people can connect, and it's cool because you're not limited to your local area. You can find people of all different backgrounds that have all these different lives and different stories, and I think that's a really cool thing. So yeah, I would definitely say it's popular. How do I think my view differs from like older and younger generations? I don't know. I would say it really depends because I've met people that are older than me, like my grandparents, for example. My grandpa it was his computer that I first started playing video games on. You know, even when we see each other to this day, we talk about, you know, video games we're playing. And for him and me, we kind of have a similar view on it, because for us, it's sometimes the world can be a little bit too much. There's like just so many different things going on all the time in the world. There's, you know, conflict, there's negativity. And that's not to say there's not positive things going on in the world. There's positive things going on everywhere. But there's a lot of negativity too, I think. And for people like myself and my grandpa, that negativity becomes too much, that, you know, the problems that we deal with in our real lives become too difficult sometimes, and you just kind of need a break. Our common opinion on that is, you know, video games kind of provide us that break. You know, we have our problems in real life that we have, and then we have our problems in whatever video game we're playing at the time. And it's nice to be able to, you know, put our real world problems aside for as little as half an hour, you know, up to however long. I mean, sometimes I'm guilty of it. I will sit in my room and play video games for 5 hours on end if I have the time, which I don't much anymore, but, you know, if I did, that's what I do sometimes. But yeah, it's nice to step away from the real world problems and focus on a different problem set that's less stressful and more rewarding. I don't know. I think that's a cool thing that him and I share. You know, my dad's really into video games too, not as much as I am, but him and I used to play stuff all the time too. So there's that side of it, but then there's the other side where, you know, I've also talked to people of older generations that, you know, don't see video games as such a positive thing, you know, where they see it as it's kind of like a time waste. There's the whole like watching too much TV melts your brain that I think we were all told when we were kids. And so they see it as kind of like a time waster, and they think that, you know, we should focus on the real world solely, and that gaming is a distraction from real world problems, which, you know, I can kind of understand that side of it. But at the same time, you know, part of me thinks too that the reason for that mindset just is a lack of exposure. I think a lot of these people in these older generations that feel that way haven't either had to or had the time, or just, you know, felt like sitting down and playing a game and seeing, you know, what it can be for people. I mean, they haven't had, you know, for me, I've made friends in video games that I still talk to this day. A lot of people that were once a part of my life and we went our separate ways physically, I still am in connection with, and we still play, you know, games together. So it's kind of nice for us to have that connection with each other while not physically being in the same aspect of life, which is cool. But I think that older generations that are more against it than, you know, people are now is, like I said, a lack of exposure. And I just don't think they've had those, you know, experiences that can be potentially life-changing to change their perspectives on it and see that, you know, hey, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. Hey, this is actually a really cool tool to build, you know, useful, meaningful, lasting connections in a way that was not available to them, you know, when they were in our spot.
I do think that gaming is quite popular with my generation. I am Gen Z, so Zoomer basically. I think gaming's been popular in the last few generations, but my generation definitely has latched onto that more so than maybe the previous. And I think my generation views it differently because we grew up basically watching people make videos about these video games that we're playing instead of just playing the video games. We're seeing how other people do it, and we're trying to, from the speedrunner perspective, we are trying to do what they're doing but better, basically. At the same time, they're trying to get better than us as well.
Well, if I didn't play any games, I'd probably, I don't know, one of those things where I would never know what would happen. If those games didn't exist, I'd probably, I don't know, still be playing guitar. Kind of gave that up.
I have always been very interested in technology, new technologies, that sort of thing, and I don't think that would change if I was born 20 years in the past. I think I would be very involved in the development of new computers and that sort of thing. Or not maybe involved in, but I would very closely follow the development of new electronics and new technologies. So I think that would be very interesting for me to be born 20 years in the past, because I would be able to witness the creation of all these new technologies that make games today possible. I wouldn't be able to play games that I play today, but I think it would be very interesting for me to be able to witness firsthand the development of all these technologies that make today's gaming possible.
I feel like that would make it a lot more boring if the games that didn't exist at that time. I would maybe go out and touch some grass, which is not very gamer of me. But then I'll have to like go around and I guess play sports and stuff with other friends, which again, we don't really, not everyone has a lot of friends or a lot of people who they can hang out with. So I don't think that also sounds like the greatest idea. It would be pretty difficult. I'll be honest with you, entertainment will be so much difficult.
If I didn't grow up playing video games, or if gaming never really existed, it's hard to imagine what I'd actually be doing now. So it's very difficult to answer this question. I'll say that I'd be riding motorcycles much more often. I don't like sports nor read books, so I don't think I'd acquire those hobbies, but it's hard to be sure.
So I'm 21. Obviously, I wasn't playing video games, at 1 year old. That'd be pretty impressive if I was. You kind of got to think about what the times were too. I mean, you think of 2000s, the first thing I think of is a flip phone. And that's not to say that video games weren't around in the 2000s, because they were. I do play games that existed back then. Like I said, Sega Saturn was one of my first consoles. I think the one that I first played was the one that was released in 96. And honestly, if I was my age then, at the point that 96 console got released, I'd probably still be playing it, to be honest with you. I don't know. It's just part of my raising is what it was. I played video games since I was, for as long as I can remember. So I think having the experience that I have now, but living back then, I think I would still be playing video games just as much as I was now. Probably I wouldn't have gotten as meaningful connections with it just because multiplayer wasn't a huge thing. The technology and the possibilities with it now weren't quite there yet. But no, I mean, I'd definitely still be playing video games, 20 years back if I was my age. 40 years earlier, I mean, if that's back in the 80s. Honestly, I think if I was my age now in the 80s, I'm really into music. There's like guitars and drums and all kinds of stuff behind me. I think if I was born 40 years earlier, I'd probably be more into music. I'm super into music, don't get me wrong, but I think I would have focused on that a little bit more than video games, just because it's, like I said, the technology that we have now was nowhere near what it is back then, if that makes sense. I don't know. But yeah, I'd probably be into music more, I think. I don't know if I was my age in the 80s and didn't have access to the games that I do now.
If I played games that didn't exist back then, honestly, I'm not sure what I would be doing instead, especially because I used to play a bunch of like Shovel Knight, Pac-Man, that kind of stuff. Kind of a tough question to answer, honestly. If I was born 20 or 40 years earlier, I would probably be making more like card games or something, or maybe doing something completely different. I honestly have no idea.
I thought these two questions would be interesting from a generational standpoint. Overall, everyone does seem to think that gaming is popular with their generation and more popular relative to older generations. With the second question, of course, it's gonna be difficult to imagine what you would have been doing in an earlier time period, but I think it's a fun exercise. Everyone here pretty much grew up with games from the start. For the most part, it seems like they leaned into their other interests, but really knows. In terms of their interpretations of why older gamers might be less friendly towards gaming compared to their generation, some of the overall ideas included a general lack of experience and exposure, and just this shift in gaming since older people were less likely to have grown up with online multiplayer gaming. There are a couple of things mentioned that I think are probably going to be continuing trends in the future. Some people did mention knowing older people who are into gaming. I think as time goes on, although it's not so popular right now, we will see more multi-generational families like Commander Cade with his father and grandfather all gaming. That being said, we do kind of see it in a way, just not the same way you would necessarily think, but your grandma playing Mahjong or Bejeweled on her tablet, still a gamer in a way. Another general trend which we may be continuing to see in the future is the competitiveness and the increasing standards in gaming. This isn't something unique to gaming, it's something I think we're seeing across a lot of things, but we'll probably continue to see it. People do have to try harder to outdo one another, and you don't have to engage in this behavior, but I think it affects you seeing what other people can do. Something mentioned in a comment and something Commander Cade mentioned also was VR. So I think that's been talked about for a while. It may be something we will be seeing more of in the future. Not sure. Other than that, there's a lot of the same themes I mentioned in part 1. Gaming appears to be growing in popularity with each new generation, so it's interesting to see a little bit about what the future might hold and perspectives on it. Hope you enjoyed. If so, give a thumbs up and subscribe to see more. And I will see you next time.